On the 18th of August 1993, the German ship, the MS Bärbel, was found drifting aimlessly in the North Sea, 80 miles west of Denmark, without a soul on board. A veritable ghost ship. The 6-man crew having disappeared into thin air. The first men to discover the vessel reported blood everywhere and signs of an almighty struggle. The ship had been set alight in multiple places, but the fire hadn't taken hold. A short time later, crews discovered the sole survivor, one André Lapin, floating in a rubber dinghy a mile from the ship. He seemed completely unfazed by the ordeal. In his possession was a large sum of money, 2 suitcases, his passport, a duvet, and 6 cans of peaches. To try and understand the story, we need to rewind a little bit. The Bärbel was, and still is, a small coastal transport ship, which sailed primarily in and around the North Sea. Constructed in Germany in 1989, it had been delivered brand spanking new to Captain Heinrich Tellmann, and he'd named it after his wife. I'm sure she was thrilled. It was, after all, a 90-metre-long, 3,000-ton capacity juggernaut. Not your typical German Hausfrau at all. Here she is currently. You'll notice the name change. It's not Bärbel any longer. More on that later. On August the 15th, 1993, the ship was carrying a cargo of rapeseed, and it set sail from London in the direction of Rostock, northern Germany. Now, Captain Tellmann was an experienced seaman. He phoned his wife that morning, making small talk. She said he'd never mentioned any trouble with the crew, or the boat, or anything else. 3 days later, the Bärbel was found abandoned by 2 fishing trawlers, 80 miles west of Esbjerg, a city on the west coast of Denmark. It had drifted miles off course with nobody aboard to guide it. They also discovered 28-year-old André Lapin afloat in his dinghy, surrounded by piles of cash and eating his tins of peaches. Both he and the boat were taken back to Esbjerg on the morning of August 19th. It was recorded that Lapin was put onto the rescue helicopter against his will and airlifted from the scene. Initially, Lapin said that a fire had broken out on the ship. He'd jumped into one life raft, while the other 5 members of the crew had climbed into the other. Eventually, they drifted apart and become separated. However, during the subsequent investigation on the ship, police found evidence of a huge fight, as well as deliberate attempts to set the boat on fire in various locations. There was evidence of blood, hair, bone fragments, and even a piece of torn-off scalp. It was like a scene from a horror movie. The forensic tech team that boarded the ship said, quote, "Here we met a sight that I will never forget. There was lots of blood, for Lapin had used the ship's crane to hoist the corpses up from the bottom of the ship, and when the bodies were tied by the legs, the blood ran out of them." Several places on the ship bore traces of fierce fighting. The captain's cabin was cluttered and smashed, and on the floor was the ship's empty cash register. Attempts were made to ignite the ship with diesel oil in several places. There were splashes of blood on the walls and floor. Many hairs and skin remnants were found. Lapin was charged with the murder of the 5 men. He pleaded not guilty. During interrogation, Lapin changed his story. According to him, 2 crew members had attacked the captain and the other 2 crew members with axes. Lapin had to kill these 2 axe-wielding maniacs in order to save himself. Fearing that nobody would believe his story, he formulated a plan. He dumped the bodies into the sea, set fire to the ship, and jumped into a life raft. He said the large sum of money he was found with, which amounted to about 50,000 US dollars, was his from a previous business deal. In court, it was reported that Lapin seemed cold and emotionless. He cooperated fully and was well-dressed and very polite. And critically for him, the investigation on board the vessel seemed to support his version of events. Blood and forensic evidence showed that each man had died where he had indicated they did. But unfortunately, the only body ever found was Captain Talkman's, some weeks later, dredged up in a fisherman's net. And as Lapin had never stated that he had killed the captain, it was not able to be used against him. The missing crew consisted of machinist Mikhail Mikhailov, sailor Vladislav Bogdan, first mate Viktor Varenko, and chef Anatoly Smolyak. If any of the others' remains had been recovered, it might have been possible to establish what had really happened. But as Lapin had inexplicably weighted down their bodies before throwing them overboard, they are unlikely ever to be found. Lapin himself told the police that there had been a dispute on board about wages and working conditions between the captain and the 5 Russian crew members. Was this the motive? Lapin's initial story about fleeing the ship in an emergency due to the outbreak of fire seemed at odds with the way he was discovered. Danish fisherman Søren Larsen remarked that he was, quote, surprised that the Russians still had time to take his comforter, a pillow, 2 suitcases, and all his papers into the life raft. What with the bustle and confusion that must have existed on board. He also described the sailors' demeanour during the rescue. Quote, anyone else would have asked how the other sailors were doing. This man was cold as ice. He made a completely calm impression and was not concerned in any way. The captain's devastated wife, Bärbel Telkman, told reporters at the time of Lapin's discovery, quote, he killed them all, and then he threw them overboard. She recognised her husband's wristwatch on the wrist of the rescued Russian sailor and said she hadn't trusted him from the moment she'd seen him 8 days prior, as they'd been making final preparations for the outgoing journey to London. After months of court hearings and deliberation, his role in the killings just could not be decided, and the jury acquitted him. He left court a free man, and somewhat unbelievably, he got to keep the money he had been found with in the dinghy. I don't know if he got to keep the 6 tins of peaches. Sometime after, the Bärbel was cleaned up, repaired, and put back into commission by the widow of Captain Telkman. And when they advertised for a new crew, whose application for a job on board the boat was top of the pile? Yes, you guessed it. None other than Andrei Lapin. He didn't get the job. Interestingly, rather than scuttling back to Russia and disappearing into obscurity, Lapin has led rather an interesting life since the incident in 1993. He became a rescue diver for the Russian state and has over 250 successful rescues on his resume. He's even received a number of recognitions from President Putin for services to his country. He's 55 years old and currently living in Kaliningrad. He has 2 children, a 14-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son, and paints in his spare time. Apparently this is something he took up while in prison awaiting trial. If you visit his online website, you can see examples of his artworks, many portraits, and several landscapes featuring the sea. You can even commission him to paint a portrait for you. He'll do it from a photograph. Prices start from a very reasonable 13,000 rubles, which is about 175 US dollars. Lapin has given several interviews over the years. He's always stuck to his original explanation about what happened on board the MS Bärbel 27 years ago. Despite the press at the time branding him the mass murderer responsible for the slaughter, he went free, and of course he was happy about that. He said that he was sorry people were so quick to judge him, and that only he knew what had really happened. He had killed 2 men in self-defense, and he'd always have to live with that. He said, quote, "It's not fun to have to kill, and I would have preferred to have been without it. I feel sorry for the family of those I killed, but I do not regret it, because if I had not killed the 2, I would not be sitting here today." What do you think happened on board the Berbel? Is it possible Lupin's version of events was the truth? If that's the case, he certainly made some strange choices in the wake of the incident. Could they all be chalked up to shock? That's it for today's case. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and please leave a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll see my future uploads.